Hey sisters, today we'll be talking about the 5 agents of evolutionary change. Well, let's talk about what the 5 agents of evolutionary change are. First, it begins with mutation, then gene flow, then non-random mating, the genetic drift, and selection. First, let's discuss what mutation is. Well, mutation is a change that occurs in our DNA sequence either through a mistake or when the DNA is copied or the result of an environmental factor. Now let's talk about gene flow. Gene flow is also known as migration. It is the movement of individuals or genetic material that they carry from one population to another. Next is non-random mating. Now, non-random mating is when organisms choose to or they even prefer to mate with others that have the same genotype or maybe even different genotypes. Now let's talk about genetic drift. Genetic drift involves changes within the allele frequency due to chance events, sampling error in other words, in selecting alleles for the next generation. Now, the drift itself could occur in any population of any size, but it has a more stronger effect on small populations. Then finally, there is selection. Selection is known as the process by which organisms with certain traits gain an advantage because of the reproduction over other organisms of that same populations that don't have those specific traits that they reproduced. Now, within selection, there is something called natural selection, which is a mechanism of evolution which favors the organisms that have better adapted to their environments. Now, there are 3 types of natural selection called directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. Now, in directional selection, which is the first selection that we'll be talking about, it states that because of an extreme phenotype, which is a characteristic or a trait that is favored over other phenotypes, it causes the allele frequency to change over in time in order to favor that extreme phenotype. In other words, an example of this is a directional selection of the giraffe with their long necks. Due to the environment they lived in, where the trees would get taller and it was harder for them to get food, they had their necks gradually grow over time in order to survive. And because of this trait, they were able to get that food. Now let's talk about stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection is when a non-extreme trait is favored instead of one of the 2 extreme traits. An example of this is plant height. In a population of plants, a plant that is short is more likely to not receive enough sunlight than a plant that is taller, but the plant that is taller is still more likely to receive more wind damage. And because of this, or the result of this, is an increase of medium height plants and a decrease in tall and short plants. And lastly, there is disruptive selection. Now, disruptive selection is when it favors both the extreme traits in a population. An example of this, or the most common example that we have known of disruptive selection, is the beak size of finches on the Galapagos Island. Because the majority of the scenes that were on the island were either small or large, the finches that had large or small beaks were more likely to survive in the condition of that environment that was on that island.